You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're gonna crack this case and prove we're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
You are... Gary the Snake. And your last name? The Snake.
Dream Team.
And new habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home.
You're clearly working at
Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 527 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, with the last episode, we looked at William Tecumseh Sherman's decision to flank the Confederates' position at Kennesaw Mountain after the failed federal frontal attacks against the rebel lines on June 27, 1864.
In a letter to his wife, Ellen, on June 30th, Sherman made it clear that he had no intention of attacking the Confederates' fortified lines at Kennesaw Mountain again, since, quote, "At this distance from home, we cannot afford the losses of such terrible assaults as Grant has made in Virginia."
Sherman believed that a continuation of the state of affairs at Kennesaw would be pointless, and the only way to avoid the possibility of once again attacking the Confederates' fortified lines there was to make the flanking movement toward Fulton, even though it meant the Federals would have to cut themselves off from the railroad for a short time.
And so, final orders for the move were issued on July 1st. They made it clear that the objective of the maneuver was to get away from the formidable enemy works at Kennesaw and force Joe Johnston, quote, to come out of his entrenchments. Sherman's plan called for Schofield to move so as to command the ground between Ollie's Creek and Nickajack Creek. Then McPherson was to shift the Army of the Tennessee from its place on the Federal left, marching south to link up with Schofield, thus positioning a strong force that could move either toward the railroad at Fulton or toward the Chattahoochee, in case Johnston decided to fall back all the way to the river.
Meanwhile, George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland would arrange itself so as to carry on manning the present Federal lines and continue confronting the Confederates in their works. Sherman also issued detailed instructions to the Union cavalry.
To all these orders, Sherman added a reminder that speed was essential to the success of the plan. Quote, "All movements must be vigorous and rapid, as the time allowed is limited by the supplies in our wagons."
As we pointed out in the last show, Schofield's advanced position south of Kennesaw Mountain was the key to Sherman's plan. To start things off, John Schofield, from his advanced position, would use troops from the Army of the Ohio to push south along Sandtown Road to create more space for McPherson to come down and operate toward the railroad at Fulton.
Sherman intended to use George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland to hold virtually the entire present Federal position fronting the Confederates' Kennesaw lines, while Schofield and McPherson conducted the flanking movement to the south. Then Thomas would follow them.
Schofield set Sherman's plan in motion at 6 a.m. on the morning of July 1st, when Milo Haskell's 23rd Corps Division set out and advanced south along the Sandtown Road.
Pushing forward against light resistance from Confederate cavalry, Haskell secured a vital road junction and then settled in to consolidate his position. Located near the Moss House, this intersection opened the door for the Federals to head northeast toward Ruff's Mill on Nickajack Creek, about 2 miles away. Beyond Ruff's Mill, the road led to Smyrna Station on the railroad, about 3 miles northeast of the mill, and Smyrna Station was around 2 miles north of Fulton Station.
On the evening of July 1st, Jacob Cox moved troops from his 23rd Corps Division forward to support Haskell's new position, as the Federals threw up earthworks to secure their hold on the important road junction.
Haskell reported it had been a long, hot day, quote, unusually warm and sultry, in Haskell's words, and he said many of his men, quote, were sunstruck or entirely prostrated by the heat and dust. It was the hardest day's work we have endured on this campaign, and was productive of the most important results.
Schofield received regular reports since he ensured his signal troops extended the line of the field telegraph southward to keep pace with Haskell's advance. Meanwhile, Sherman had instructed Thomas and McPherson to demonstrate with skirmishers and artillery that day to annoy the Confederates and divert attention from 23rd Corps' movement to the south.
Because Schofield reported that his position was, quote-unquote, very extended, Sherman changed his plans a bit by offering to send one of McPherson's divisions ahead of the rest of the Army of the Tennessee to help Schofield. And Schofield said he'd be happy to receive it, and planned to replace Cox with a new division so that Cox could close up on Haskell's position. And so Sherman sent instructions to McPherson to start one of his divisions southward at 4 a.m. on July 2nd.
Upon receiving the order to move a division south to help Schofield, James McPherson sent Sherman's old division, now commanded by Morgan Smith in 15th Corps. It was the same division that had conducted the failed attack at Pigeon Hill on June 27th.
Smith started his men promptly at 4 a.m. on July 2nd. The weather was just as hot and oppressive as the day before, and many men suffered sunstroke during their 11-mile march. But they pulled up on the left of Schofield's position near the Moss House at 11 a.m. and replaced Cooper's and Strickland's brigades of Haskell's division.
Smith's newly arrived troops finished the new line that Schofield's men had begun the night before, that stretched from Ruff's Mill Road toward Sandtown Road.
Once they were relieved by Smith's troops, Haskell moved Cooper and Strickland farther to the left to fill up the gap between the Union position at the Moss House and that of Cox's division. Schofield now had about 13,000 men dug in around the road junction. He was 4 miles south of the Confederate left flank and 6 miles from the Chattahoochee River, the last natural obstacle between the Federals and Atlanta.
Schofield said he now felt, quote, really secure, for the enemy could not detach force enough to dislodge us without abandoning his position at Kennesaw and hazarding a general engagement in the open field.
Meanwhile, opposite the Confederates' Kennesaw lines, other Federal forces continued to demonstrate all day on July 2nd to divert attention from what was taking place to the south, beyond the rebels' left flank. Acting on orders, Newton's 4th Corps Division opened a furious artillery bombardment for half an hour at 6 a.m.
Then Newton's skirmishers began aggressively probing forward, which they continued all day. The historian of the 96th Illinois reported that, quote, many had lame arms and shoulders from firing their muskets so constantly.
To the north, McPherson's artillerymen also kept up a heavier-than-usual fire on July 2nd. 40 or 50 Union guns pounded Little Kennesaw, where a Confederate serving in a Missouri battery, W.L. Truman, judged a shell came screaming in, quote, every minute for 3 hours.
While all this heavy shelling and skirmishing took place along the Kennesaw line, The Union cavalry scouted the ground south and west of Schofield's position at the Moss House.
The Federal horsemen had screened Schofield's right flank during Haskell's move to the Moss House on July 1st, but they couldn't find a way to cross Sweetwater Creek until early on the morning of the 2nd. Then they forced a crossing at Sweetwater Town, which was only guarded by some Georgia state militia. George Stoneman's and Edward McCook's cavalry troopers were then able to push south to the Chattahoochee River, at which point they were a dozen miles southwest of Schofield's position at the Moss House.
Meanwhile, aside from Smith's division, which had already been sent to aid Schofield, the rest of McPherson's Army of the Tennessee prepared all day on July 2nd for its move to the south.
The Army's supply and ammunition trains set out early on the 2nd to get a head start. It was impossible to entirely hide the movement of so many wagons from the Confederates' view, but the infantrymen and artillerymen tried to make arrangements so that their own evacuation of their trenches and battery positions that night would be a secret. For example, they lay straw along the rocky portions of roads leading toward the rear to muffle the sound of the wheels of the gun carriages.
Staff officers delivered detailed instructions to commanders about the purpose behind the movement and the timing of each unit's withdrawal. Francis Blair's 17th Corps was to leave first, from the far Union left, at 9 p.m., with each division pulling out in succession from north to south.
Then Grenville Dodge's 16th Corps would pull out, followed by John Logan's 15th Corps. The objective of Blair's 17th Corps was the next major road junction south of the one Schofield and Morgan Smith's division already held at the Moss House, near which the widow Mitchell made her home. Once they completed their move there, Blair's infantry would be the southernmost Federal troops, aside from the roving Union cavalry.
Dodge would advance from the Moss House toward Ruff's Mill on Nickajack Creek, while Logan would halt at the Moss House and form McPherson's reserve. All three corps were to take along just one baggage wagon for each regiment and battery and march quietly and quickly to its assigned position.
Meet the new iSIMS, the single talent acquisition platform that's fully future-ready. It works wherever and however you hire, with insights no one else offers. One solution that fits seamlessly into your existing tech stack, which is why IT and HR leaders trust it. With the best of enterprise-grade software and AI, iSIMS helps you identify and secure the right talent faster. iSIMS, powering exceptional hiring. Learn more at isims.com.
Security program on spreadsheets, new regulations piling up, and audit dread? It's time for Vanta. Vanta automates security and compliance, brings evidence into one place, and cuts audit prep by 82%. Less manual work, clearer visibility, faster deals, zero chaos. Call it compliance or call it compliance. Get it? Join the 15,000 companies using Vanta to prove trust. Go to vanta.com/calm.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
McPherson's troops from the Army of the Tennessee began pulling out of their positions as scheduled on the evening of July 2nd, and units from George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland were shifted up to replace them. As part of this operation, Thomas also positioned Colonel Benjamin Scribner's 14th Corps Brigade so as to refuse the far left or northern flank of the Union line, and Scribner's men worked all night on July 2nd to dig a new line of earthworks to protect that flank.
Once his plan was set in motion, Sherman had a last-minute change of mind about the massive federal supply depot at Allatoona, a dozen or so miles to the north on the railroad. Worrying that rebel cavalry might ride around the Union flank and attack the depot as soon as they realized McPherson had pulled out, Sherman ordered the accumulated stores to be moved northward up the rail line to safety as quickly as possible.
The heights of their Kennesaw line offered the Confederates a superb observation platform, and the Yankees couldn't hide all the signs of their movement from the rebels. Reports streamed in to Joe Johnston's headquarters on July 2nd that the enemy was shifting large numbers of wagons. Staff Officer Thomas Mackle noted in his diary, quote, "Every indication of move to Chattahoochee by Sherman."
Johnston knew full well that Sherman was making a major flanking effort south of Kennesaw Mountain. He also knew that Schofield was already some distance below the Confederate left, and that he couldn't afford to let the Yankees advance even farther on that front.
And so Johnston decided to abandon the strong position at Kennesaw, but not withdraw all the way to the Chattahoochee. He had in mind that the Army of Tennessee would take up a new position at Smyrna Station, only 6 miles farther south from Marietta along the railroad. Accordingly, Johnston's headquarters issued a circular regarding the withdrawal to all units of the Army at 1:30 on the afternoon of July 2nd.
The artillery was to pull out at dusk, while Wing Loring's infantry was to start their withdrawal at 10 p.m. William Hardee's and John B. Hood's units would follow at 11.
All 3 corps commanders were to leave a rear guard in the earthworks until 1 a.m. Johnston's circular included instructions about each formation's line of march and the new position they were to take up at Smyrna Station.
It took some time for the orders to make their way to various units. Daniel Reynolds' brigade between Little and Big Kennesaw didn't receive the circular until 5 p.m., while French's division, a bit to Reynolds' left, received it 2 hours before.
Artilleryman W.L. Truman in that Missouri battery up on Little Kennesaw admitted he and his comrades were disappointed with the news. He wrote, quote, "We hate to leave our perch. It is such a lovely and exciting place. Exciting to be a target up in the clouds, and besides, we can see and enjoy so much."
As it turned out, just as McPherson's Federals began to pull out of their positions that night, the Confederates began to pull out of their lines as well. As Johnston's circular had instructed, the rebel artillery was the first to leave.
Artillery Battalion Commander Major George Storrs had worked out a careful plan to extricate his guns from the top of Little Kennesaw in the fading light of the evening of July 2nd. He'd made certain that the military roads running down the east side of the mountain were cleared and ready for the movement. Storrs' gun crews worked efficiently and managed to bring down every piece without the Yankees being any wiser. This was mostly due to the fact that the batteries had made it a habit to screen their embrasures with brush to conceal the reloading process from the Federals, and now that brush concealed the withdrawal of the guns.
Opposite the Federals' 4th Corps lines, Cleburne's division conducted the withdrawal with quiet efficiency. Captain Samuel Foster commanded the skirmishers of Granbury's brigade on the night of July 2nd. He waited until 1 o'clock in the morning and then began to fall back, one man at a time, to the empty main trench line.
There they assembled at a designated spot. After the last man came in, Foster recalled they waited in the dark a suspenseful half hour before a guide arrived and led them to the rear, where they caught up with the brigade as it was marching towards Smyrna Station.
Pulling away from Cheatham Hill was more difficult for the Confederates there than from any other part of their lines. However, a covered way leading toward the rear, constructed since the Federal attack on June 27th, helped the process.
It was a trench covered over with timber to make a roof, which helped to deaden the sound of troops now moving toward the rear. Alfred Vaughn kept the 11th Tennessee behind when the rest of his brigade evacuated its works. Interestingly, to light up the no man's land between the lines, the Tennesseans were told to, quote, throw turpentine balls to deceive the enemy, end quote, before they followed their comrades out of the trenches.
Meanwhile, George Manny maintained a strong skirmish line to cover his brigade's withdrawal. Lieutenant Thomas Manny of Company B, 1st Tennessee, was put in charge of a dozen men who were told to crawl forward into no man's land on their hands and knees to establish an outpost line in front of the rebel earthworks.
In the darkness, the Tennesseans made their way over the parapet and through the abatis until they were uncomfortably close to the Federal works. After Lieutenant Manny positioned his men, now and then he would crawl along their line to make sure everything was all right. Once, however, he got turned around in the darkness and ran into the muzzle of a musket. He later wrote that when he heard the hammer of the musket click as it was cocked, he froze as, quote, the past life of the writer came up before him. All the mean things he ever did were passed in review in a few seconds.
After his life passed before his eyes in those few seconds, Manny asked in a low voice for the man holding the musket to identify himself, and thankfully for him, it was one of his own men, although a man who Manny considered to be, quote, a little bit off in the head. The lieutenant admitted he was quite rattled when he realized how close he had come to being killed by this fellow, quote, for he had no more sense than to shoot anyhow.
Well, despite these perils, the Confederates pulled away from Cheatham Hill without incident. In fact, the entire Army of Tennessee conducted the withdrawal from its lines at Kennesaw with consummate skill. The night was dark and cloudy, but the roads were dry, and for the most part, those roads were well known by the Confederates. So most units arrived on schedule at the new Smyrna line, where they began to dig in before the Yankees made their appearance.
As for the Federals, they saw indications of unusual activity by the Confederates as early as 9:15 p.m., but McPherson believed those signs were the prelude to an enemy night attack. This led McPherson to temporarily stop pulling out of his lines.
Sherman and George Thomas, however, thought the rebels were evacuating their Kennesaw position, but McPherson wanted to take no chances. So he discounted the report of one of his signal officers, saying that just before dusk on July 2nd, it appeared as if the number of campfires along the Confederate line was dramatically reduced. The signal officer also reported a thick column of smoke rising from Marietta, indicating that the rebels were destroying large amounts of supplies.
The Federals on Cheatham Hill received confirmation of the Confederate withdrawal earlier than any of their comrades. Sporadic skirmish fire continued until about 1 or 2 o'clock on the morning of July 3rd, followed by silence.
Then, according to Captain Frank James of the 52nd Ohio, quote, we were startled by a loud voice from the front, calling, say, Yanks, don't shoot, will you? I want to come in. They're all gone.
The Confederate deserter made his way across no man's land and told the Yankees that his former comrades had left. The Federal skirmishers cautiously went forward and discovered that the man was telling the truth. The rebel works were empty.
George Thomas informed Sherman at 2:45 on the morning of July 3rd that the rebels had abandoned their lines, and that deserters assured the Federals Joe Johnston was pulling back to a new position to the south. That meant the 2-week-long standoff between the opposing armies at Kennesaw Mountain was over.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is To the Gates of Atlanta, From Kennesaw Mountain to Peachtree Creek, July 1st through 19th, 1864, by Robert D. Jenkins, Sr.
This is another of Jenkins' excellent books on the Atlanta campaign, and if you want to get a head start on our coverage of the next phase of the campaign, well, there's no better place to start than here with To the Gates of Atlanta.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Edgar R., Dylan A., Jeff E., David R., and Ronan M. have done recently, so a big thank you to them.
Then as we wrap up this show, we wanted to apologize for the new episode release schedule lately, which has mostly been on an every other week basis. And that is going to go on just a bit longer, since we're going to be out of town next weekend.
On a riverboat cruise. Yeah, you see, American Cruise Lines, which does a number of different historically focused cruises, asked us to take part in this year's Civil War excursion. So we'll be spending 5 days on the Tennessee River portion of the tour, from Shiloh to Chattanooga, giving presentations each day, and also going out with the folks on different site visits. Anyway, we've been carving out time over the last couple of months getting ready for that trip, and that's taken away from working on new episodes. But after we get back from this trip, things will be back to normal.
So thanks for your patience, and thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.